Okay, today, grasshoppers, you are invited to the backdoor deck at La Casa di Moretti. You'll be hearing the ring things in the background, whatever those are called. So periodically, just do your best to ignore them. But it's too nice a day. I got to be outside to teach you this lesson. So today we are trying to understand why the Soviet Union collapsed and why communism ended in Europe in 1991. And so if you follow along on your screen here with me, you can see I'm going to walk you through some of the main things you need to know, um, culminating in a document activity where I've got a link to documents that you're going to use when I'm done explaining some of this to you, to this prompt here. Explain why communism collapsed in Europe in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Refer to at least 3 documents as you write your answer. A little bit longer this time, 10 to 12 sentences. This should be done in your journal. So let's begin with the lecture outline. In the 1970s, and this is where I am, right here. In the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union actually started to get to uh, along more. Okay, is a period of more relaxed relationship with each other known as détente. Okay, and I hinted at this in your lesson on China that you guys just completed. Um, our president at the time, Richard Nixon, became the first president in United States history to visit not just one, but 2 communist countries. He went in person to China and the Soviet Union in an attempt to play the 2 off each other. Because since the 50s, China and the Soviet Union have been adversaries in the world, each of themselves viewing themselves as the leaders of communism in the world. Okay, so Nixon's trips back and forth actually started to normalize relations with both China and the Soviet Union for a while there. And we even, if you look here, signed something called the SALT Treaty, which was an agreement with the Soviets to lessen the number of nuclear weapons that were being produced. It stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And this was a big moment. I mean, up till now, we've been arms race, arms race, arms race, arms race. But really, by the 70s, both we and the Soviets are interested in like ramping down some of the tension for a while. And, the U.S. economy is not good in the 1970s, so that's part of it. And we certainly would like to not have to spend as much money on nuclear weapons. And the Soviets are desperate to not spend as much money on nuclear weapons because they can't afford it at all. Like the U.S. is struggling with it, but the Soviets can't afford it at all. They put all of their efforts into missiles and nuclear weapons and the delivery of these nuclear weapons. And their society is significantly hurting for stuff that we call consumer goods by the 1970s, right? And all the Soviet bloc countries are because the Soviet Union is taking stuff still from like Poland and Lithuania and like Ukraine and whatever. And all these Soviet bloc countries now are like broke. They're all stripped of wealth, and the Soviets are generating enough wealth, and what they are generating, they're putting all into nuclear weapons. And so they're interested in like not having to make as many anymore also because their people, don't have blue jeans or toasters or rock and roll music or very many cars, or these are called consumer goods. And the Soviets are really feeling that. So they're happy to like bring down the tension of the during the 1970s. But then something interesting happens in 79. A country that had been under the sphere of Soviet influence, Afghanistan, changes its government. And the Soviets feel threatened by this change, and they invade in 1979. And that abruptly puts an end to this period of détente, this period of relaxation between us and the Soviet Union, because by invading Afghanistan now, the Soviets are threatening to destabilize the entire region, potentially further into the Middle East. And so this caused a world crisis. The immediate U.S. response is to boycott the Soviet, the Olympic Games in 1980, which are supposed to take place in Moscow in the Soviet Union that year. But as you see, as we scroll down, we're going to be more involved than that even. So in the 1980s, as President Reagan enters the White House, he is going to bring the tension up again with the Soviet Union. He's going to call them the evil empire. You know, we'd really been moving away from that kind of talk, but now Reagan is going to put the heat on him again. You're evil empire. You've invaded Afghanistan. The world is telling you to get out, but you're not. And so we're going to start spending on nuclear weapons again. We're going to put more pressure on you to try and bring you to the negotiating table. And, you know, this is going to be, again, too much for the Soviets to be able to handle. What we're also doing is we're secretly, covertly fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan by giving weapons to the people of Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, okay? This is going to become the Soviet Union's Vietnam because they're going to be in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, about 10 years, which is about the time, if you remember, the United States was in Vietnam before we were forced out. So we are going to get payback by supporting the Afghans, particularly a group of freedom fighters known as the Mujahideen. Now, the Mujahideen are fighting valiantly against communism, but the reality is that they're also made up of different groups of fundamentalist Muslims, okay? Groups that will later become the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, okay? These are radical groups that are happy to accept US weaponry and technology and training to fight the Soviets off, but they're not happy. They have no interest in adopting our Western lifestyle. I mean, they want to institute radical Islam into Afghanistan when this is all over. So we're literally arming the very people that we are later going to fight in a war on terrorism. They're going to have our weapons and use them against us after 1989. They're going to take the training that we used for them and use it against us after 1989. One of the guys that we're going to arm and help train is Osama bin Laden himself, the guy who masterminded the September 11th attacks in 2001. So this is very short-sighted by the United States. It's a great move to fight this proxy conflict by arming and helping the Mujahideen, but it's going to come back to bite us hard later on in the 1990s and 2000s, okay? Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, groaning under the pressure, the Communist Party chooses a reform-minded guy who's also somewhat young to be a premier of the Soviet Union. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, okay? And you see it here spelled. And he sought to save communist Russia and its empire in Eastern Europe by trying to institute reforms. He didn't want to get rid of communism. He wanted to change it enough to make it more functional, okay? One of the things he wanted to do is allow glasnost, right? Or translated openness. And what this meant was that he wanted to allow greater freedom of speech and of the press and of expression in the Soviet bloc countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Lithuania that were underneath the umbrella of the Soviet Union, as well as in Russia itself. But you can guess, by allowing more freedoms, people get a taste of this and they don't want to go back, okay? They're done with the old, like, totalitarian style regime. And though Mikhail Gorbachev is seeking to save communism, he's really sowing the seeds for its destruction, okay? He's taking a big risk in doing this because he risks irritating all of the old school hardline communist members of the Communist Party in Russia by doing this. And that's exactly what he is going to do. The United States loved it, by the way. When Gorbachev starts instituting glasnost, then our president, Ronald Reagan, goes and visits him, and Gorbachev comes and visits the United States, and they have a series of summit meetings, which will eventually even result in the Soviets signing a nuclear deal to reduce weapons as well. So it's really weird. In the 80s, under Reagan, we heat up the things on the Soviets. We put the real pressure to them. And then by the mid 80s, we start relieving that pressure when they look like they want to change their society. And then we come back to the table to sign anti-nuclear deals with them, while at the same time, we are opposing the Soviets in Afghanistan by supporting the Mujahideen. If you guys feel like that's a complicated situation, it's because it is. You know, rewind and listen to it again if you need to. All right, my explanation of it. The other thing here you see that reform that Gorbachev is going to bring is called perestroika. And perestroika means restructuring. And the Soviets are going to attempt to inject some capitalism into their communist society in order to try to save it. They want to adopt some models of capitalism because communism just doesn't generate enough wealth. And if you remember when I first told you about the Soviet Union being formed, Vladimir Lenin himself had tried this with the new economic policy back in 1920, okay? But they had moved away from it under Stalin and had kind of stayed away from it. Gorbachev is trying to reintroduce this, and it's going to be too little too late, though. The financial impact will not be felt in time to stop the general collapse of the Soviet state and all of the countries it's controlling, okay? One of the early markers that communism is collapsing is in 1989 when the Berlin Wall comes down. You know, the Soviets lose in Afghanistan in '89, and they are forced to retreat. During that same year, the Berlin Wall is toppled. Now, why do countries like East Germany, Poland, Lithuania, and others feel starting in '89 that they can start breaking away? Because, right, the Soviets used everything they had in Afghanistan. And because of their inability to raise money to replace what they had, they don't now have any enough military power to hold the Warsaw Pact countries in the Warsaw Pact any longer. And they're going to start breaking away. Not to mention the Soviets had forced all these Warsaw Pact countries to send troops to Afghanistan to help them fight there. And a lot of these places like Poland, Lithuania, and East Germany and Czechoslovakia, they're tired of it. They've had it. The war has had negative impacts. The war in Afghanistan has had negative impacts on their people as well as in Russia. And they revolt. And Russia doesn't have the money or the military, realistically, to put down the revolt this time, okay? So here's where I want you to take a look at the coverage in '89 of the Berlin Wall coming down. I remember watching that, by the way, as a kid. I was a sophomore in high school, if you can believe that. I was just around your age when that happened. Huzzah for 1980s Moretti. So then you see, once things start coming apart, Russia itself comes apart, and there is a coup d'etat, if you remember, a quick seizure of power. There's an attempt by the hardline communist leaders to overthrow Gorbachev, who they think is ruining their communist society, right? The old school guys that never agreed with him and his reforms are now going to try to overthrow him, but they fail. When they rise up against him, it turns out that there's no enthusiasm to replace Gorbachev with a communist leader who wants to be a tougher communist. Like, there's no enthusiasm, there's no desire to do that. And so the whole thing comes apart. And so now, not only have all of the Warsaw Pact countries broken away and declared independence, but then you also are going to have Russia itself collapse. And a man named Boris Yeltsin is going to become the new president of a non-communist Russia. And throughout the 1990s, a lot of these former communist countries like Poland and Lithuania and whatnot are really going to, and Russia itself, are really going to struggle financially because they've gone literally 40 years plus without having any sense of capitalism. All their jobs have come from the government, right? Or they've been created by the people. They're private enterprise and capitalism and buying and selling of goods is not something that they know. It's been 40 some odd years. And so there's really going to be a lot of, in the immediate aftermath, after all the celebration is done from, ending communism in Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union, um, there's really going to be a lot of hardship in Eastern Europe as these countries try to adapt to what it's like to no longer have somebody give you a job. Okay. And when there are not very many jobs to be had and the financial situation does not improve immediately, there's going to be a lot of alcoholism in these Eastern European countries. There's going to be a lot of suicide, depression. A lot of people are going to try to leave and come to the United States. Some of you guys, even in my class, probably have parents who left Eastern Europe around this time because it was so much better here. Eventually, these countries will rebuild, but it's going to take a decade plus to rebuild, for these countries to reinstate a capitalist type system in Europe. So in Eastern Europe. So while that's happening, in Russia, by the way, it's struggling too. And when Yeltsin is out in 1999, Vladimir Putin, that's right, the current guy in Russia, he's been in there since 99 in some way, form, or another, okay? Vladimir Putin is only happy to take over Russia and institute essentially state capitalism there, the same way that it exists relatively in China today, okay? Where it's like Vladimir Putin and his personal buddies, his cronies, right? That's why this is called crony capitalism. They're going to set up essentially a mafia state. If you're a friend of Vladimir Putin, you'll get all the benefits of the capitalism that he is generating in Russia, but the wealth of it really goes to you if you're a friend of Putin and of Putin himself. Okay, the term for this economically is also called an oligarchy, where a few people run the capitalist system. They put the taxes on the businesses. They siphon off from those taxes for their own personal benefits, and it's very similar to what China does today. They're no longer communist in China. They call themselves communist, still a communist party, but they're really not. It's state capitalism. In Russia, it's state capitalism also, but it's they're dropped the whole idea of even being a communist party. It's just Russia, and Russia remains, like China, very expansionistic and aggressive. All you have to do is look at what they have done in recent years by moving into the Crimea Peninsula and threatening places like Ukraine, and the Russians meddling in United States elections back in 2016, and exerting their will in places like Syria. And you could just see the Russians are interested in kind of rebuilding an empire now that communism is gone. It kind of brings us to where we are today under Vladimir Putin, okay? Aggressive, expansionistic, just like the Chinese are in a post-communist world. So now that you guys have kind of an overview of what's going on, what I'm going to ask you to do here is, to click on this link that I have here, and it will bring up a series of documents, and I want you to read through those documents, and I want you to refer to at least 3 of them when you write your answer in your journal to this prompt down here to explain why communism collapsed in Europe in the late 1980s and early 90s. Okay? So put it all together. Give me some explanation. Make this good, grasshoppers. I believe in you, all right? I think that that's all I have to say, so I'll see y'all next time.